Neha was packing her suitcases with anticipation. She and her daughter were getting ready for a trip, just about 2,000 kilometers, and they would be in Miami. The journey promised to be special. Just her and her daughter, only the two of them and no one else. They would sunbathe, lie on the beaches of Miami, swim, ride jet skis, and no one would disturb them. Unfortunately, this trip, which began so wonderfully, would end in tragedy, and it would be a journey from which only one of them would return. At 3:30 a.m. on June 27, 2025, a call came into the Miami Emergency Services from El Portal, a quiet residential neighborhood. The caller was Neha Gupta, a 36-year-old pediatrician from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Neha reported in a trembling voice that her 4-year-old daughter, Arya Talathi, had fallen into the backyard pool of the house they were renting while her mother was asleep. Emergency responders were immediately dispatched to the address. They arrived just a few minutes after the call. What they found in the backyard was a horrifying scene. 4-year-old Arya was still submerged in the deep end of the pool. She wasn't moving and showed no signs of response. Rescuers were shocked that the mother hadn't yet pulled her daughter from the water. Neha explained that she had, of course, tried to get Arya out for about 10 minutes, but hadn't been able to. She also said she couldn't jump into the pool because she didn't know how to swim. Without wasting a moment, the paramedics pulled Arya out of the water and began performing initial resuscitation, desperately trying to bring the little girl back to life. But Arya showed no response to their efforts. She was carried to the ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where for nearly an hour, doctors and nurses did everything they could to save her. But it was too late. At 4:30 a.m., 1 hour after her mother's call to emergency services, Arya was pronounced dead. The officers took the grieving mother to the station, where they asked her to explain what had happened. She began by saying that 2 days earlier, on June 25th, she and Arya had left Oklahoma, traveling nearly 2,000 kilometers to Miami. Neha had finally gotten the chance to spend time with her daughter, and she decided to take it. It was supposed to be a wonderful vacation, and at first, it was. Upon arriving in Miami, they settled into a spacious house with a swimming pool, which they had rented for a few days. Thursday, June 26, went perfectly. Neha and Arya spent the day enjoying the warm summer sun, sunbathing, swimming, riding jet skis, and playing on the beach. It was a beautiful time, just for the two of them. They returned to the house sometime between 7 and 8 in the evening. Arya was so tired from all the fun that she fell asleep, and her mother carried her inside and put her to bed. Around 9 o'clock, Neha woke her up so they could have dinner together. They went to bed around midnight, lying down together in the master bedroom, holding each other. The evening had been peaceful and completely normal, but around 3:20 a.m., Neha was awakened by some faint noise. That's when she realized her daughter was no longer in bed, nor in the room. She noticed that the sliding door leading to the pool was open. Neha rushed to the backyard and found her daughter in the pool. The little girl wasn't crying, splashing, or reacting to her mother's shouts. For about 10 minutes, Neha tried to pull her daughter from the water. Only when she understood she couldn't help her on her own did she dial 911. It was the worst kind of tragic accident, the kind that changes a family's life forever in a matter of minutes. A child wakes up in the middle of the night, goes outside without waking the mother, and unnoticed, accidentally falls into the pool. But within just a few hours, the police began to doubt whether what had happened was really an accident. To begin with, experienced detectives were unsettled by the way Neha described the tragedy. Her account sounded too detached, as if it hadn't happened to her at all. They found it hard to believe that Neha, not only a mother but also an experienced pediatrician, could stand at the edge of the pool for 10 minutes, helplessly watching the final moments of her daughter's life. Yes, Neha explained that she didn't know how to swim, but even that excuse didn't hold up under scrutiny. Because if you ask any parent what they would do if they saw their child drowning, the answer would be the same: anything it takes to save them. In such moments, instinct takes over. Fear and logic fall away. Experts call this hysterical strength, a powerful adrenaline-driven response when ordinary people suddenly display strength and courage beyond normal human limits. It's when a person doesn't stop to assess risks or think through options. The body simply acts. These are the same kinds of moments people often hear about. A mother lifting a car with her bare hands to save her child trapped underneath. That's why Neha's behavior shocked investigators. She didn't just fail to jump into the water. She didn't call for help, didn't run to the neighbors, didn't even try to pull Arya from the pool using a stick or a towel. And again, this wasn't just a terrified mother. This was a pediatrician whose career was built on helping children. Yet at the moment when her own child needed her most, she did nothing, even knowing that a 10-minute delay could mean losing her daughter forever. More questions arose when it became clear that the pool wasn't particularly deep. Of course, a 4-year-old couldn't have stood in it, but her mother easily could have. She could have stepped in and reached her daughter while keeping her own head above the water, which led to an obvious question. Why didn't she save her daughter when she clearly could have? The likely answer was found soon enough, back in Oklahoma. For many years, Dr. Neha Gupta had built a reputation as a respected pediatrician. She worked at a hospital affiliated with the University of Oklahoma, which meant that in addition to treating young patients, she also taught at the university, giving lectures to future medical professionals. She was also engaged in research. Her studies on the topic of coronavirus had been published in leading medical journals. In short, she had all the credentials one would expect from a specialist of her caliber. As for her personal life, Neha met, fell in love with, and married a colleague, pediatrician Saurabh Talathi. Before long, the young couple welcomed a beautiful daughter, Arya Talathi. But unfortunately, after Arya's birth, by the spring of 2022, cracks began to appear in the family's once stable life. Neha filed for divorce, and from that moment, tensions only escalated. What followed in court was a fierce battle filled with mutual accusations. In July 2022, Neha sought a protective order against her ex-husband, alleging domestic abuse. The order remained in effect for nearly a year, but when the time came to renew it at the end of 2023, the court denied her request, citing a lack of evidence to support the abuse claims. By the time the divorce was finalized in 2024, the couple's relationship had completely deteriorated. They had become bitter enemies. Neha fought fiercely for sole custody of Arya, but the judge denied her request. She tried to limit the father's visitation rights but failed again. Even her earlier claims of domestic violence, which had once earned her court protection, were dismissed. In the end, the court granted joint custody to both parents. The decision devastated Neha, but unfortunately, it wasn't her last blow or humiliation. In May 2025, just a month before Arya's death, the court dealt her another painful hit. Neha was ordered to pay her ex-husband's legal fees, amounting to about $80,000, and his attorneys filed papers to begin garnishing her wages. By then, her emotional state had already begun to crumble. She started acting erratically. For instance, showing up at Arya's daycare, disrupting staff, and causing scenes. In fact, as far back as 2023, both parents had been ordered to undergo psychological evaluations, but apparently neither Neha nor Saurabh completed them. In 2025, the issue resurfaced, and Saurabh insisted that his ex-wife undergo the evaluation. Neha responded that if she had to do it, then he should too. The dispute ended in May 2025 when the court temporarily transferred full custody of Arya to her father. The final blow came soon after. On May 30th, Neha was terminated from her position at the Children's Hospital, and shortly after, from her teaching post at the University of Oklahoma. For anyone, such a series of losses would have been overwhelming. Everything Neha had built through years of effort, earning her medical degree, completing her residency at a New York medical center, and building a career in Oklahoma, was gone in an instant. Something inside her broke. She planned a trip without telling anyone about it, not her ex-husband, not the court, and took Arya to Miami. There, she not only chose a rental house with a swimming pool, but also took her daughter jet skiing, even though neither of them could swim. According to security camera footage and rental records, Neha and her daughter were the only occupants of the house during their stay. In other words, there were no witnesses to what happened that night. And the more detectives pieced together the facts, the more it seemed that this trip hadn't been about creating happy memories, but about ensuring that only one of them would ever return. Still, even the most hardened investigators wanted to believe it was a tragic accident, a mother's terrible mistake, until the autopsy results arrived and shattered everything they thought they knew. The medical examiner's report turned the entire case upside down. There was no water in Arya's lungs or stomach, an undeniable finding that completely contradicted her mother's story. It's worth noting that in roughly 15% of drowning cases, no water is found in the lungs. But in this instance, the forensic conclusion was unequivocal. Arya did not drown. In addition, the autopsy revealed bruises and small cuts inside Arya's mouth, on the inner sides of her cheeks. These injuries couldn't have been caused by the paramedics' resuscitation attempts. According to the pathologist, such marks could appear if someone smothered Arya, for example, with a pillow while she struggled to breathe or tried to resist. In such a case, no fingerprints or hand marks would be left on the victim's skin, since the pillow would act as a barrier. The official autopsy report concluded that Arya was already dead before she entered the pool. Her body had been placed in the water afterward, a staged scene meant to make it look like an accidental drowning. Finally, the autopsy exposed another lie in Neha's account. She had told investigators that she woke Arya around 9 p.m. so they could have dinner together. But Arya's stomach was completely empty. The girl had not eaten anything that evening. The secret departure from Oklahoma, the empty stomach of the child, the lack of any meaningful attempt to save her, and the physical evidence proving that the girl had not drowned, all of it led police to suspect that Neha Gupta had tried to cover up a murder, staging it to look like an accidental death in the pool. On July 1st, just 4 days after Arya's death, Miami police obtained a warrant for Neha's arrest. By that time, she had already returned home. Although she hadn't been required to stay in Miami, it struck investigators as highly unusual that a mother would leave her child's body in the morgue and go home so soon. When officers arrived at her house, they announced themselves loudly, identifying as police and asking Neha to open the door. No one responded, though they noticed movement inside. The officers were forced to break down the door and search the house. Eventually, they found the suspect hiding in a pantry, pressed against the wall behind the door. Her attempt to hide did not look good for her. Neha Gupta was charged with first-degree murder. The story immediately exploded across local news outlets and social media. People were horrified. No one could understand how a woman who had dedicated her entire career to saving children's lives could be accused of killing her own daughter. It didn't make sense. Many believed there had to be a mistake, and her lawyers made that argument loudly and clearly. Her defense team insisted that the police had rushed to arrest a grieving mother without completing a full and thorough investigation. They emphasized that Neha had cooperated extensively, speaking to investigators multiple times since the very first day. Even her divorce attorney publicly stated that the idea she could harm her child was utterly inconsistent with her character and the life she had lived. "She's a mother in mourning," he said, "not a criminal." If Neha was truly guilty of killing Arya, then the question is, what could have been her motive? Psychologists who study such crimes generally distinguish 5 possible motives that drive mothers to commit acts this horrific. Accidental, when a mother intends to punish or discipline a child but doesn't mean to kill. Altruistic, when a mother convinces herself that death will somehow spare the child from suffering. Psychotic, when hallucinations or delusions drive her actions. Unwanted child, when the mother sees the child as an obstacle to her goals, whether financial, romantic, or personal. Revenge, when the act is meant not to hurt the child, but to hurt someone else, often the father. Detectives in this case believe the motive was revenge against Neha's ex-husband and Arya's father. Neha was exhausted by loss. She had lost custody, money, her job, and even her professional reputation. She felt defeated, cornered, angry, and vengeful. Nothing in her life was going according to plan. After losing everything, she might have decided to take away from Saurabh the one thing he loved most, their daughter. But she also didn't want to spend the rest of her life in prison, so she allegedly rented the house and staged the death as an accident in the pool. Yet the prosecution's version had a serious weakness. According to their theory, Neha smothered Arya and then placed her body in the pool. But Neha, being a doctor, would have known that an autopsy could easily reveal that Arya hadn't drowned. That inconsistency raised doubts about whether the act was premeditated at all. There was also her own statement. Neha insisted that she had definitely closed the sliding door before going to bed. If she had said something like, "It was hot, so I left the door open," or "I don't remember if I closed it or not," her story might have sounded more believable. But her certainty made her version seem poorly thought out, as though she hadn't rehearsed or planned it. That, detectives realized, might suggest something deeper, that the killing, if it happened, wasn't planned in advance. Nevertheless, the prosecution seemed confident in the strength of the evidence they had gathered. Then, a sensational new development. On August 7th, at a hearing in the case, the prosecution announced that they had dropped the first-degree murder charge against Neha. Instead, she is now being charged with involuntary manslaughter with aggravating circumstances. This shocking news immediately raised 2 important questions. What actually happened, and would the prosecution even be able to prove the defendant's culpability in Arya's death? Neha's attorney was quick to comment on the news. In his view, the prosecution already realizes that they will not be able to prove that Neha intentionally harmed her daughter. Indeed, despite what seemed to be irrefutable pieces of evidence, such as the signs of strangulation on Arya and the absence of water in her lungs and stomach, it is difficult to believe that her mother acted with intent. On one hand, she might have considered an act of revenge to hurt her ex-husband, inflicting maximum pain in a situation that could no longer be undone. On the other hand, Neha has a medical education, a life full of experience, and obvious intelligence. It is impossible to understand why she would try to stage a drowning accident if she truly intended to kill Arya. Why simulate drowning, knowing that the autopsy would immediately reveal the truth? Why strangle a child and leave marks inside her mouth that clearly indicate staging? If this were a deliberate murder, it was carried out very carelessly, and Neha was never careless. However, Neha's lawyers will also have their work cut out for them in defending a client who has a tendency to lie. Several years ago, Neha Gupta gave an interview discussing a scientific paper she had written on the coronavirus. She answered a series of questions from the journalists, mostly on medical topics. At the end, he asked her to share an interesting fact about her personal life that viewers wouldn't know. Neha responded that she loved extreme sports, such as skydiving, scuba diving, and snorkeling. A person who cannot swim and who was afraid to jump into a shallow pool, yet claims no fear of diving with a snorkel or scuba gear. Neha had lied. But when? During the interview or later in the interrogation room at the station? That is for the court to decide. And if Neha does not accept a plea deal, millions of people, especially parents who will never be able to comprehend how someone devoted to saving children's lives could have killed her own daughter, will follow the trial with unwavering attention.